Nixon had been working late into the night, his mind focused solely on finishing an important project for work. The clock on his desk blinked past midnight, but the words on his screen still blurred into one another. Despite the late hour, he couldn't stop himself from pushing forward. The looming deadline was unforgiving, but he knew he couldn't afford to disappoint his boss. The coffee on his desk had long gone cold, but he continued typing with precision, every now and then glancing at the clock. The digital clock on the wall ticked to 6 a.m., and it felt as though the night had stretched endlessly before him. Exhaustion settled in, but Nixon refused to stop. His wife, Hannah, had already left for work hours ago, and the only sound in the house was the occasional tapping of his keyboard. The house was quiet, save for the soft breathing of Emilia, their 7-year-old daughter, who had fallen asleep on the couch while watching cartoons. As Nixon wrapped up his work, he decided to prepare breakfast for Emilia, who would soon wake up for school. The quiet hum of the house seemed peaceful, but Nixon couldn't shake the heavy weight in his chest. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a feeling of unease lingered in the back of his mind. A few moments later, Emilia walked into the kitchen, her small hands rubbing her sleepy eyes. She smiled at Nixon as he placed a plate of pancakes in front of her. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" Emilia's voice was soft, filled with innocence. Nixon smiled warmly, a father's love flooding his chest. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" Emilia hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around the room as if she was trying to find the right words. "If Mommy does something bad, but asks me to keep it a secret, should I?" Nixon froze, his heart skipped a beat. The question hit him harder than he expected. His mind raced, and for a moment, he couldn't find the right words to answer. His first instinct was to reassure Emilia, to protect her from whatever might be troubling her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple question. "Honey," Nixon began, his voice steady but laced with concern, "if Mommy asks you to keep something a secret, it's important to talk to me or someone else you trust. Secrets like that can hurt people, and you never have to carry a burden like that alone." Emilia nodded, but the confusion in her eyes didn't fade. Nixon could feel the weight of her question pressing down on him, and he knew he had to get to the bottom of it. Later that morning, as the hours passed and the house grew quieter, Emilia suddenly blurted out something that shook Nixon to his core. "I saw Mommy with another man last night, in the kitchen. They were close." The words hung in the air, as though time had frozen. Nixon's heart dropped into his stomach. His mind raced, trying to process what Emilia had just said, but it was as if the truth had punched him in the gut. Hannah, his wife of 10 years, was seeing someone else. The weight of the revelation felt like a crushing blow. "Are you sure, sweetie?" Nixon asked, his voice trembling, trying to keep his emotions in check. Emilia nodded solemnly. "Yes, I'm sure. They were hugging and kissing. I didn't mean to watch, but I had to." Nixon's hands tightened around the edge of the counter. He felt his breath catch in his chest. The room seemed to spin as he tried to make sense of it all. Was it really happening? Was his family falling apart in front of his eyes? He wanted to scream, to lash out in anger, but instead, he took a deep breath. He had to stay calm for Emilia. He couldn't let her see his pain, not yet. He had to find out the truth, even if it meant facing the hardest truth of all. After Emilia left for school, Nixon spent the rest of the day in a haze. His thoughts were consumed with the haunting images his daughter had described. He tried calling Hannah several times, but she didn't answer. His mind wandered to the darkest corners, imagining all the possibilities. Was it just a fling? Or had this been going on for much longer? That evening, after dinner, Nixon decided to take matters into his own hands. He knew Hannah had a camera in the kitchen for security purposes, a recent addition to their home for peace of mind. He had never thought to check it, but now, it felt like the only way to know for sure. He sat down in front of the computer, his hands shaking as he navigated to the footage from the night before. The video began to play, and Nixon's stomach twisted as he watched the image of Hannah and the other man in the kitchen. They were laughing, too close, too familiar. His worst fears were confirmed. Nixon paused the video, his heart heavy with betrayal. The truth was undeniable now, and it burned like fire. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The pain of watching his wife with another man was unbearable, but he had to face it. For the rest of the night, Nixon sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the screen. The sounds of the house felt distant, as though he was no longer truly in it. He had to confront Hannah. He had to tell her what he knew, even if it shattered everything. The following morning, Nixon felt the weight of the night's revelations settle deeper into his chest. The video footage from the security camera replayed in his mind over and over again, each time sharper, more vivid. The image of Hannah with another man, someone who wasn't him, gnawed at his heart. But there was no turning back now. He had to confront her. He couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Emilia was still asleep, a quiet innocence that seemed to mock the storm brewing in the house. Nixon quietly made his way to the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee that sat untouched in the corner of the counter. He needed clarity, but no amount of caffeine could shake the haze clouding his mind. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as he sat in the empty silence, waiting for Hannah to return home. Every second seemed to stretch endlessly, each moment pulling him closer to the inevitable confrontation. By the time Hannah finally walked through the front door, it was already late afternoon. Her footsteps echoed through the hallway, but Nixon couldn't bring himself to look at her right away. He could feel the tension in the air, a thick, suffocating silence between them. Hannah dropped her keys onto the hallway table, her back to him as she began to take off her jacket. Nixon, holding his breath, finally spoke. "Hannah, we need to talk." His voice was quiet, but the command in it was unmistakable. Hannah turned around, her eyes briefly scanning his face before they narrowed. "What's going on, Nixon? You're acting strange." He felt his pulse quicken, but he steadied himself. "I saw the footage, Hannah. I know what happened last night." The words hit the air like a slap. Hannah's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was defensive, but Nixon could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." Nixon stood, his fists clenching at his sides. "I saw you with another man. Don't deny it, because I have the proof right here." He gestured to the security camera footage he'd watched the night before, the footage that had torn apart the very fabric of their lives. Hannah's face went pale, and she took a step back, as if trying to distance herself from the reality that Nixon had just exposed. Her lips trembled, and she glanced toward the hallway, as if considering escape. "Nixon, please," she began, her voice shaky. "It wasn't what you think. I never meant for you to find out like this." "Don't lie to me, Hannah," Nixon said, his voice rising with every word. "You were with him. You kissed him. Don't try to minimize it." She took another step back, her eyes welling with tears. "It was a mistake, Nixon. A moment of weakness. Please, you have to understand. This is not who I am." Nixon's heart ached, but his anger was a steady flame, burning through every word she said. "A mistake? You think that's what this is? You've been lying to me, Hannah. For how long?" "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You already have," Nixon snapped. The words felt like daggers, but they were the truth. "You've already destroyed everything." The silence between them grew heavier as the weight of their broken marriage settled in the room. Nixon's mind raced, fighting the urge to break down in front of her, but he couldn't. He wouldn't. He had to remain strong, for Emilia. Hannah stepped forward, her hands reaching out as if to touch him, but Nixon recoiled. The hurt in her eyes only deepened the wound. "Please, Nixon, just let me explain. We can work through this." Nixon shook his head, stepping away. "No, Hannah. It's too late for explanations. The trust is gone. There's nothing left to salvage." Hannah's face crumpled, the facade of control she'd been holding on to slipping away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears falling down her face. But Nixon couldn't bring himself to say the words she wanted to hear. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done." He turned away, walking toward the hallway. "I want you to leave, Hannah. I need space. I need time to think." Hannah's sobs followed him, but Nixon didn't stop. He couldn't look back. The pain of betrayal was too much, and as much as he wanted to believe her, he knew it was impossible. Nixon spent the rest of the evening pacing through the house, replaying every moment, every conversation, every sign he'd missed. The image of Hannah with another man haunted him. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't go back to the life he'd once known. Too much had been shattered. The next morning, as Emilia returned home from school, she looked up at him with innocent eyes. She didn't understand the gravity of the situation, and Nixon couldn't bring himself to tell her yet. But he knew that the time would come when he'd have to explain it all. He glanced at her, forcing a smile. "Hey, sweetie," he said, his voice softer than he felt. "How was your day?" "Good." Emilia smiled brightly, oblivious to the storm that had just torn their family apart. "Can I help make dinner tonight, Daddy?" Nixon nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He could feel the ache in his chest, but he had to keep it together, for Emilia. For her, he would keep moving forward, no matter how much it hurt. The following days after the confrontation were a blur for Nixon. Every morning, he'd wake up to the same empty house. The silence felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The absence of Hannah's presence in their home, which once felt like a comfort, now felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. Nixon tried to focus on Emilia, doing everything he could to keep her life as normal as possible. He helped her with her homework, cooked dinner, and even tried to make their home feel like a place of refuge in the midst of the chaos. But his mind was constantly racing, replaying that painful conversation with Hannah, the images of her and the other man, and the unspoken hurt that was now buried deep within him. On the fourth day after the confrontation, Nixon received a message from Hannah. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up with her name. He hesitated before picking it up, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't spoken to her since the night of the argument, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear from her. But he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. With a deep breath, Nixon unlocked his phone and read her message. "Nixon, I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I know I've hurt you deeply, and I don't expect forgiveness right away. But I need to explain everything. Can we talk? Please, for our family's sake." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Nixon found himself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. A part of him wanted to hear her out, to give her a chance to explain, but another part, one that was much stronger, wanted to cut all ties and move on. The trust was gone, and no amount of explanations could change that. Still, he couldn't deny the desire for closure. For his own peace of mind, he needed to hear her side, even if it meant reopening the wound. He typed a response, his fingers shaking slightly as he typed out each word. "Fine. We can talk. But I'm not sure what there is to say." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Then, he sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, waiting for her reply. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. "Thank you. I'll be over later tonight. Please, just give me a chance to explain." Nixon stared at the message, feeling a strange mixture of dread and curiosity. He knew he had to be strong during this conversation. He had already made up his mind that he couldn't go back to the way things were. But part of him, the part that still loved her despite everything, wondered if there was something deeper he hadn't yet uncovered. That evening, Hannah arrived at the house just after dinner. Emilia was in her room, playing with her toys, blissfully unaware of the tension that had been building in the house for days. Nixon led Hannah into the living room, his heart pounding in his chest. The room felt colder with each passing second. "Have a seat," Nixon said, his voice tight. Hannah sat down on the edge of the couch, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. Nixon didn't sit down. Instead, he stood across from her, his arms crossed over his chest. He couldn't bring himself to make it comfortable. This wasn't going to be a comfortable conversation. "Hannah, you've got 5 minutes," Nixon said, his voice sharp. "Tell me everything. I'm done playing games." Hannah looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. For a long moment, she didn't speak, as if searching for the right words to say. Nixon felt his patience thinning. He didn't want to hear excuses or justifications. He wanted the truth. Finally, Hannah looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Nixon, I don't know where to start. I was unhappy. I know that sounds like an excuse, but it's the truth. I felt disconnected from you for a long time now, but I didn't know how to talk about it." Nixon's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. "The man you saw, his name is Adam. We met through work, and at first, it was nothing more than just a friendship. But as time went on, I felt like you and I were drifting further apart, and I just started looking for comfort elsewhere. I never meant for it to go as far as it did." Nixon clenched his fists at his sides. He felt the sting of betrayal deep in his chest. "So, you cheated on me because you were unhappy?" he asked, his voice cold. "You didn't even try to talk to me about it? Instead, you decided to lie and sneak around behind my back." "I never wanted to hurt you," Hannah said softly, her voice trembling. "It wasn't about you. It was about me. I was lonely, Nixon. And I didn't know how to deal with it. I thought, maybe if I could find someone who understood me, it would make things better, but I was wrong. So wrong." The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Nixon could feel the anger building up inside him, but he didn't want to give in to it. "Not yet. Do you love him?" Nixon asked, his voice low and dangerous. Hannah shook her head immediately. "No, I don't. I'm not in love with him. I was just trying to fill a void I didn't even know was there. But I know that doesn't make what I did any less wrong." Nixon exhaled sharply, his frustration boiling over. "So, what now? You want me to forgive you? You think that just because you're sorry, everything will go back to normal?" Hannah's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out a trembling hand toward him. "No, Nixon. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I want to try to make things right, for the sake of our family. If you can't forgive me, I'll accept that, but please, just know that I'm truly sorry for what I've done." Nixon stood there, staring at her, the pain of it all weighing heavily on his heart. Part of him wanted to take her in his arms, to tell her that everything would be okay. But another part, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, could never look at her the same way again. "You need to leave," Nixon finally said, his voice rough. "I need time to think." Hannah looked at him, the heartbreak in her eyes almost unbearable to witness. She stood slowly, her body trembling as she walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned to him one last time. "I'll always love you, Nixon. I'm so sorry." But Nixon said nothing. He just watched as she walked out, leaving him alone in the silence of their broken home. The house felt emptier than ever after Hannah left. Nixon stood in the doorway, his mind racing with the weight of everything he had just heard. The words she had said, her apology, her sorrow, they all rang hollow in his ears. But what cut deeper than anything was the realization that the woman he had loved, the woman who had been his partner for so many years, was no longer the same. She had changed. And so had he. The emptiness of the house mirrored the hollow ache in his chest. Emilia's laughter, once the heartbeat of their home, felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. Nixon slowly walked back into the living room, his eyes scanning the walls that held so many memories, photos of vacations, family gatherings, birthdays. All of it now felt like a different lifetime. He sat down on the couch, the worn fabric scratching against his skin. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the city, but the brightness felt irrelevant. He couldn't escape the darkness inside his own heart. Nixon tried to focus on the task at hand, being there for Emilia. She had been through enough, and he knew he couldn't let her feel the strain between him and Hannah. But every time he looked at her, a flood of memories washed over him, memories of the life he had once thought was unbreakable. His family was fractured now, and he had no idea how to put the pieces back together. As the days passed, the weight of the situation bore down on him harder. Nixon tried to keep a semblance of normalcy for Emilia, but the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. Emilia, ever the perceptive child, noticed the change. She no longer asked about her mother in the same way, but Nixon saw the confusion in her eyes. She knew something was wrong. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Emilia looked up at Nixon with those big, innocent eyes of hers. "Daddy, when is Mommy coming home?" Nixon's heart ached at the simplicity of the question. He paused for a moment, trying to find the right words. He knew he couldn't lie to her, but he wasn't ready to explain everything. Not yet. Not when he wasn't sure himself. "I don't know, sweetie," he said, forcing a smile. "Mommy has some things she needs to figure out, but she loves you very much. And so do I. Emilia didn't seem fully satisfied with the answer, but she didn't press. She ate her dinner quietly, pushing the food around on her plate. Nixon could see the sadness in her eyes, the same sadness he felt deep within himself. She deserved so much more than this, more than a broken home, more than a father who couldn't fix things. That night, after Emilia had gone to bed, Nixon sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where Hannah had once sat. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Joanna, the woman he had met just a few days ago after his confrontation with Hannah. They had spoken briefly at a coffee shop, shared some words of comfort, and now she was reaching out again. Nixon, I've been thinking about you. I hope you're okay. I know things are tough right now, but if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. Nixon stared at the message for a long moment. He had appreciated her kindness, but he wasn't sure he was ready to open up to anyone yet. Not after everything that had happened. But there was a part of him, a small, vulnerable part, that wanted to take her up on the offer. He was alone, truly alone, and the idea of sharing his pain, of having someone who could understand, felt like a lifeline he desperately needed. He took a deep breath and replied, "Thanks, Joanna. I'm not sure I'm ready to talk just yet, but I appreciate you reaching out. Maybe soon." He hit send, and as the message left his phone, a strange sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't much, but it was a step. A small step toward letting someone in again, toward starting to heal. The next morning, Nixon woke up with a familiar heaviness in his chest. He had another long day ahead of him, but for the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have to carry this pain alone. Maybe there was a way forward, even if he couldn't see it yet. As he sat at the kitchen table, preparing breakfast for Emilia, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from the local support group for separated parents he had signed up for, an idea suggested by his therapist during their last session. The group was meeting that evening, and the message reminded him of the importance of connecting with others who understood the struggle. Nixon hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face a room full of strangers, each one with their own pain and baggage. But he knew he had to try. For Emilia. For himself. He made a decision. Tonight, he would go. As the evening approached, Nixon found himself standing in front of the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The idea of sharing his grief with strangers felt intimidating, but deep down, he knew he couldn't keep isolating himself. He opened the door and stepped into the unknown. Nixon stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces around him. The support group was held in a modest community center, and the air was thick with the weight of shared experiences. A handful of people sat in a circle, talking quietly, exchanging small pleasantries, and waiting for the session to begin. Nixon hesitated at the doorway, unsure if he belonged there. He had spent the last few days hiding from everything, his emotions, his anger, his grief. But standing there now, the feeling of isolation gnawed at him. A woman at the front of the room noticed him standing by the door and offered a warm smile. "You must be Nixon," she said gently. "Welcome. Come on in. We're just about to start." Nixon forced a smile and nodded, stepping forward into the circle. His eyes met the faces of the others. Some looked just as unsure as he felt, while others seemed more comfortable, at ease in their vulnerability. He took an empty seat and tried to settle himself, but his mind was still racing, replaying everything that had led him here. The failed marriage, the betrayal, the loss of trust, it all seemed like too much to unpack. The woman who had greeted him, a kind-looking middle-aged woman named Linda, took a seat and introduced herself. "I'm Linda, and I've been leading this group for a while now. We're all here for the same reason, to support each other through the pain of separation and the challenges of co-parenting. This is a safe space, where you can speak freely, without judgment." Nixon's throat tightened, but he nodded. He didn't know if he was ready to speak, but just being there, surrounded by people who understood the ache he felt, was already a small relief. For the first time in days, he didn't feel quite so alone. Linda smiled and nodded toward the man next to her, a tall man in his late 30s named Greg, who had been a regular in the group for months. "Why don't we start with you, Greg?" Linda said kindly. "Why don't you share how things have been going for you?" Greg, a man with tired eyes and a quiet demeanor, took a deep breath and began. "It's been tough. I'm still adjusting to life without Sarah. We've been separated for almost a year now, and it feels like everything is falling apart, one piece at a time. My son, Ben, he doesn't really understand why things changed. I just keep telling him that we're still family, but I don't know if I believe it anymore." His voice cracked slightly, and Nixon saw the sadness in his eyes. Greg's words resonated with him, more than he expected. The idea that family could still exist after everything had been broken seemed like a foreign concept to Nixon. How could he still call what he had with Hannah a family? The pain of it all was too overwhelming. As Greg spoke, Nixon found himself reflecting on his own situation. Emilia was so young, and yet she had already been affected by the changes in their family. He didn't want her to feel abandoned, but what was he supposed to do? Could he ever forgive Hannah? Could he build a new family for her, without the pain of the past? Linda gently guided the conversation, allowing others to share their stories. Nixon sat quietly, listening to each of them. There was the young woman named Kate, whose fiancé had walked out just before their wedding, leaving her to navigate life as a single mother. Then there was Mark, whose wife had left him for another man after years of marriage. Each story was different, but the feelings of betrayal, confusion, and heartache were the same. As the group spoke, Nixon felt a sense of solidarity growing within him. These people understood what it felt like to have your world turned upside down. When the group finally turned to Nixon, he felt his heart race. His mouth went dry, and for a moment, he wondered if he could just stay silent, letting the session pass without him having to speak. But he knew that wasn't why he was there. He needed to start healing, and that meant facing his own pain. Nixon took a deep breath and looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. They all had their own stories, their own struggles, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was the only one. "I'm Nixon," he began, his voice shaky at first. "And I don't really know where to begin. My wife, Hannah, she's been seeing another man. I found out a few days ago. My daughter, Emilia, she's been asking about her mom, and I don't even know how to explain it to her. I feel like everything is falling apart, and I don't know how to put it back together. I don't even know if I want to. I don't know if I can forgive her." His words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. For a moment, Nixon wasn't sure if he had the strength to continue, but then he felt the eyes of the group on him, not with pity, but with understanding. Greg gave him a nod of encouragement, and Linda smiled softly, her eyes filled with empathy. "It's okay, Nixon," Linda said gently. "It's okay to feel lost. It's okay to not know what comes next. You're here because you want to heal, and that's the first step. You don't have to figure everything out today, or even tomorrow. But every day, you take one small step forward. And that's enough." The words sank in slowly, and for the first time in a long while, Nixon allowed himself to believe that maybe he could get through this. Maybe he could rebuild, not the life he had before, but a new life, one that was his to create. As the meeting ended, Nixon walked out of the community center with a heavy heart, but something had shifted. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how he was going to fix things, or even if he could. But he had taken a step forward. And that, he realized, was the beginning of healing. The days after the support group meeting felt different. Nixon wasn't sure if it was the catharsis of finally sharing his pain with others or the gentle encouragement he had received from the group, but there was a small flicker of hope that had been absent for a long time. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was drowning in the weight of his emotions. It was as though the process of opening up, of speaking his truth out loud, had created a crack in the wall of his grief, and light was slowly beginning to seep through. That morning, after dropping Emilia off at school, Nixon took a different route home. He had grown tired of the same routine, the same painful thoughts that played on repeat every day. Today, he would do something different. He had promised himself that he would start taking action, even if it was just small steps. As he walked through the park near his home, Nixon couldn't help but notice the way the sun cut through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was crisp, and the world seemed to be waking up from a long slumber. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply breathe, to let the cool air fill his lungs and push away the weight that had been hanging around his shoulders. As he sat on a bench, reflecting on the last few days, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the name on the screen, Hannah. He stared at the message for a long moment, unsure of what to do. A part of him wanted to ignore it, to block her out completely. But another part of him, the part that still carried a shard of love for her, couldn't turn away. She was still the mother of his daughter, and somehow, he knew he had to face the reality of their situation, no matter how painful it might be. He opened the message. Nixon, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. I understand if you're not ready to talk, but I just want to let you know that I'm truly sorry for everything. I know I've hurt you, and I don't know if I can ever make it right. But I want to try. For Emilia. For us. Nixon read the message several times, his chest tightening. He didn't know what he expected, but it wasn't this. The apology, the words that came so easily, felt like a balm on a wound that had barely begun to heal. Part of him was tempted to respond, to tell her everything he was feeling, to finally ask the questions that had been burning in his mind since the moment he discovered her betrayal. But another part of him knew that responding in haste would only lead to more heartache. He put the phone down, closing his eyes as he tried to center himself. He had to take control of his own life, his own emotions. He had already made the decision that he could never go back to the way things were with Hannah, no matter how much he cared for her. But he also knew that he couldn't keep carrying the weight of anger and resentment. For Emilia's sake, for his own sake, he needed to find peace. When he got home, he spent the rest of the day in quiet reflection. He didn't call Hannah, didn't respond to her message. Instead, he focused on the one thing that mattered most, his daughter. Emilia needed him. She needed stability, love, and reassurance. He couldn't let her see the cracks in his own heart. The next evening, Nixon made dinner for Emilia, something simple but comforting. As they sat down at the table, Emilia looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy, when will we see Mommy again?" Nixon felt a pang in his chest, but he forced a smile. "I don't know, sweetie. Mommy's still figuring things out, but I promise you, she loves you very much. And so do I." Emilia nodded, though she still looked uncertain. "I miss her." "I know you do, baby," Nixon said softly. "But we're going to be okay. You and me, we've got each other." That night, as Emilia went to bed, Nixon found himself standing in the doorway of her room, watching her sleep. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, and yet her little world had already been shaken by things she didn't fully understand. Nixon promised himself that he would do whatever it took to give her a sense of security, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort. He went to bed that night with a heavy heart, but he also had a sense of resolve. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The pain would linger for a while, and he would have to navigate his feelings toward Hannah, toward forgiveness, and toward moving on. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control. He could take steps forward, even if they were small. The next morning, Nixon decided to go back to the support group. He had started to feel a sense of connection with the people there, a sense of belonging. He wasn't ready to open up fully, but he knew that each visit was a step in the right direction. He had learned that healing wasn't a linear path. It was messy, full of ups and downs, but as long as he kept moving forward, he knew he would be okay. As he walked into the group that evening, he was greeted by friendly smiles, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like an outsider. He was one of them, a person who had been broken but was slowly putting the pieces back together. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start living again.